Today is April 8th, 2026. Everyone is asking the wrong question again. Yesterday, the press ran wall-to-wall coverage of one phrase. Vice President Vance, standing in Budapest next to the Hungarian Prime Minister, said the United States has tools in its toolkit that it has so far not decided to use. That was the sentence. 6 hours of cable news followed. Social media accounts started trending the word nuclear. An account associated with the former vice president posted that Vance had implied Trump might use a nuclear weapon. The White House responded by calling those people, and I am using the administration's exact words here, absolute buffoons. They were not wrong. And here is what I want to spend the next few minutes on, because the nuclear panic yesterday obscured a weapons story that is actually remarkable. Not the weapon everyone was terrified about, the one nobody bothered to explain. Let me start with what Vance actually said, in full context, because the full context is the entire point. He said the United States has largely accomplished its military objectives. He said there are still things the administration would like to do on Iran's ability to manufacture weapons. He said Iran has two pathways: become a normal country or face continued economic and military pressure. He said the president has tools he has not yet deployed, and he said he was hopeful negotiations would avoid any of that becoming necessary. That is not a nuclear threat. That is a negotiating posture. There is a precise word for what Vance was doing: leverage. He was applying it publicly, explicitly, and with the full backing of a president who has said Iran will never have a nuclear weapon 74 times on the record, documented and published by the White House itself. 74. That is not a man preparing to hand Tehran a nuclear deterrence achievement by becoming the first American president to use a nuclear weapon since 1945. That is a man who has spent decades saying the same thing and then went and proved he meant it by doing something no prior president was willing to do. And this is where the story the press missed yesterday actually lives. Because while every cable anchor was gaming out nuclear scenarios, nobody explained the weapon that was already used, the one that actually changed the strategic picture, the one that every previous administration lacked because it did not exist yet in operational form. The GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrator, 30,000 pounds, 20 feet long, dropped exclusively by a B-2 Spirit stealth bomber. It penetrates up to 60 meters of reinforced earth before it detonates. To put that in terms anyone can understand, that is roughly a 20-story building's worth of rock and concrete sitting above the explosion. The previous generation of American bunker busters, the ones that were in the arsenal when Obama was trying to pressure Iran, could handle targets maybe 1/4 as deep. The deeply buried facilities that Iran spent decades and billions of dollars constructing to be impervious to air power were, in large part, built around the assumption that American conventional bombs could not reach them. They built wrong. In June of 2025, 7 B-2 bombers dropped 14 of these weapons on Fordow and Natanz in a single operation called Midnight Hammer. Fordow is built inside a mountain. Iranian engineers specifically chose that location because they believed its depth made it immune to conventional attack. They were operating on accurate information about the prior American arsenal. They were not operating on accurate information about the current one. After Midnight Hammer, the Air Force awarded Boeing a sole source contract worth $61.55 million to replenish the inventory. A sole source contract because Boeing is the only company on Earth that makes this weapon. The Air Force used language in that contract notice that is worth reading carefully. It described the replenishment as critically needed to restore operational readiness and ensure Air Force Global Strike Command possesses the necessary assets to support strategic contingency war plans for all combatant commands. That is the government saying plainly that this specific weapon is central to its contingency planning, not as a demonstration, as a standing capability. Now here is the point that the nuclear panic coverage actively prevented people from understanding. The entire premise of Iran's nuclear deterrence strategy for decades has been depth. Build underground. Go deep enough and no conventional weapon can reach you. Develop the nuclear program inside mountains and hardened bunkers that sit below the threshold of conventional penetration. That strategy worked against every American administration, from Carter through Biden, because the weapons that could defeat it did not exist in operational form until last year. The GBU-57 was developed starting in the early 2000s specifically with facilities like Fordow in mind. It entered service in 2010. It was never used in combat until June 2025. Trump used it. That is what changed. The depth strategy that protected Iran's nuclear program for 20 years is no longer a reliable shield against American conventional power. And the White House, by announcing a $61 million restocking contract in February and then striking Karg Island again this week, was not signaling nuclear intent. It was signaling something more operationally significant. The conventional toolkit now includes a weapon that does what only nuclear weapons could previously do without crossing the threshold that no American president has crossed since Truman. Vance's reference to tools in the toolkit, read against that backdrop, is not mysterious. The tools include weapons that can reach facilities Iran believed were unreachable. The tools include a second carrier group. The tools include a power grid strike capability that Trump made explicit when he said Tuesday would be Power Plant Day. These are not nuclear options. They are conventional options that 6 years ago did not exist in the form they now exist in. This is the thing that the nuclear panic erased from yesterday's coverage. The arms control community itself, specifically the Arms Control Association, noted during yesterday's chaos that the U.S. intelligence community's own 2026 worldwide threat assessment does not assess Iran as having achieved nuclear weapons capability. Iran enriched to almost 60% purity after the 2015 deal collapsed. 90% is required for a weapon. The gap between 60 and 90% is not trivial. Trump's stated objective, articulated 74 times and then pursued through military action, is to prevent Iran from closing that gap. The president's tool for enforcing that objective is a 30,000-pound conventional bomb that can reach facilities buried inside mountains, not a nuclear weapon. There is a dry joke available here, and I am going to use it. The Federal Reserve spent most of yesterday paralyzed by oil hitting $115 a barrel because of a nuclear panic generated by a 6-word phrase that the White House immediately clarified. Then a ceasefire was announced 90 minutes before the deadline, and oil dropped 9% in 30 minutes. Markets are not afraid of nuclear war. Markets are afraid of uncertainty. The panic itself was the volatility event, not the underlying weapons reality. I have spent 4 decades watching the gap between what is actually happening in a conflict and what the media says is happening. The gap is rarely comfortable to look at directly. Yesterday, it was particularly wide. What is actually happening is this. The United States deployed a conventional weapon in June 2025 that penetrated the crown jewel of Iran's nuclear infrastructure. It restocked that weapon in February 2026. It struck Karg Island, the terminal through which 90% of Iranian crude moves, for the second time this week. It announced a 2-week ceasefire contingent on Iran reopening the Strait of Hormuz. And formal talks are now scheduled for Friday in Islamabad. The question the coverage should be asking is not whether Trump is about to go nuclear. The answer to that question is obviously no, stated 74 times and confirmed by the White House's own rapid response team in language that was, let us say, direct. The question worth asking is what it means for global security that the United States now possesses a conventional weapon capable of destroying buried nuclear facilities that were previously immune to non-nuclear attack. Because that capability does not expire when this ceasefire holds. It does not disappear if talks in Islamabad succeed. It is now a permanent feature of what American conventional military power can threaten against any country that buries weapons of mass destruction deep enough to have previously felt safe. For 20 years, depth was an answer to American air power. It is not an answer anymore. That is the story from yesterday, not the word that trended.